Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for coming on a chilly Sunday morning on a holiday weekend. It's very good to see not only all of you, but each of you. I am particularly honored and gratified that Rabbi Tully Hartstark of SAR High School has joined us. And he was, as usual, extraordinarily sensitive and gracious, and asked me on Friday if I would be in any way uncomfortable having him here when I addressed this topic. And I assured him that just the opposite is true, and that I'm very honored to have him. And in addition to that, I think that all of these discussions would be better held if people imagined that those whose opinions they were discussing were actually seated before them, and what is going on between colleagues, friends, human beings. I think the debate would be ennobled and cleaned up of a lot of its difficulties. First, perhaps I should ask the most basic question, and that is, why am I giving this talk? I don't fall into the categories that would normally find someone at this podium. A, I'm not a professional posek. I'm a mora hora. I try and help my community to find its way in halacha as very best I can. But for the big things, I go to specialists. I'm not a blogger, by which I mean, I say this without, I don't mean it cynically or ironically. I don't necessarily feel the need to take a stand every single time the zephyr of controversy blows over the Jewish people. You won't find me speaking in many areas of controversy. I've occasionally been called to task. Why didn't I give some sort of fiery address on whatever it is that the latest brouhaha is brouhahaing about? And it's not my way. I generally speak only in terms of positive aspiration and in terms of basic principle. I don't necessarily get involved in the trenches. So why is this case, this particular instance, a little bit different? Well, it's primarily different because it is so close to home. It is because my shul has a very long, very proud, and exceedingly positive relationship with SAR. The rabbinic impetus for SAR largely came from my predecessors. One of its components began right in this building, product of the vision of Rabbi Seibel, Zichrono Livrocha, combination of his vision and his adoration of his little girl, whom he couldn't bear the idea of shipping off to Manhattan, and wanted her to have a day school in Riverdale. That is the truth, as the family tells it. The vision of my predecessor, Libodel L'Chaim, Rabbi Greenberg, who was there when much of the early concept of SAR, not only its concept but its ethos, were being developed. The names of the great lay leaders who both established and shaped SAR through all of the years, including but not limited to Mr. and Mrs. Jesselson, Zichronim Livrocha, Lahavdu Ben Achayim o Ben Achayim, the Bravmans, the Bentheims, all of those names which are part of SAR legend They were all people whose spiritual home was right here in this building. Perhaps even more, it is the school that has been my partner not only in the great work of raising generations of Jewish children here, and when I say my partner, I don't mean personally, I mean in a corporate sense. This has been the home shul to some of SAR's most outstanding graduates, and I would like to think that the RJC and SAR have been partners through all of these years. Perhaps even more important, and here I do speak personally, SAR is where my own children received their foundations in everything. And we will never cease to be grateful for that. I say these things not in a kind of a wistful past tense. These are all verbs of continuity. And even though numerically there are other communities now which heavily feed the ranks of SAR students, I still feel that SAR is our yeshiva. And I am extremely proud of that relationship. The fact that SAR High School began here in this building, just as did one component of SAR, the Academy, is something, it's a little footnote which will be a proud part of the RJC's history for as long, I believe, as there is an RJC. That great pride extends to the colleagues in Jewish education who are the SAR faculty and administration. And there is a very good argument that Riverdale, as the unique Jewish community that it is, would never have been imaginable if not for the presence and the qualities of the SAR Academy. And so when I suddenly find my yeshiva at the center of an international debate which is all too often acrimonious, disrespectful, a debate in which the names of people, colleagues, and teachers on either side of the aisle, whom I both respect and love, are dragged through the mud and spoken of with disrespect, I am pained. In addition, because this is a matter of halacha and the clarification of what halacha is and how it is determined and decided, it is also very much within the purview of my responsibilities as the Marda Asra of the shul, as the families of the shul, the members of the shul, turn to me and ask, what is the nature of the halachic identity of the Riverdale Jewish Center, its attitude, and I guess the buck stops here, my attitude in these areas. I would say preliminarily, and I was asked why I didn't give this talk on a Shabbos morning when I very likely could have had several fold captives in the audience, and thereby, to whatever extent anyone finds either heat or light in my remarks, could have affected that many more people. I have to tell you honestly that the machine that stands in the back of this room is, in a sense, my crutch. Why am I lame? Why do I feel the need of a device to record each word and the tone in which each word is spoken? It is because I feel, aside from a sense of fear of being used for target practice, like absolutely everyone else who is involved in this discussion on the internet, that Wild West show where cowards shoot from behind rocks of anonymity and allow themselves liberties with the reputations of people so much greater than themselves that even comparison is irrelevant. I feel the need to be able to document exactly what I said and didn't say, but even more in a positive sense, in what I hope is the most positive sense. I believe that in this debate, maybe just in terms of personal recognition, I'm accepting upon myself a level of responsibility which is, I think, new in our contemporary world. You know, the Chafetz Chaim, in his discussion of Lashon Hara, tells us that under certain circumstances, one is even forbidden to say something nice about someone. What could be wrong? Why are you forbidden to say something nice? If you suspect that saying something nice is going to ignite a reaction in which the equal and opposite, someone whom you know harbors animus to that individual, will be triggered in a spewing of venom, then you are held responsible for triggering what results from your language, even if your language itself was innocuous. I think what we have seen in this and in other similar debates is that people who are very careful, who choose their language with great care, perhaps we're just not used to it, are not doing the calculus on the grumma issue about where these debates will go in the mouths of those anonymous, reckless people who will take it to the next step. And I'm not going to use some examples that I brought, but the analogy that I would give: striking a match is not an act of arson. If you happen to know that you are in a methane pocket surrounded by gas, and you strike a match, then that is potentially an act of arson, because a match can bring about a colossal explosion. And so I walk with trepidation, not because I am afraid of public speaking, but because I'm afraid that what usually, when I just speak to my flock, is not much more than lighting matches. Because we speak globally, we speak locally, we speak intimately, we speak with a sense that even if I disagree with a given sentiment, I know the person who is speaking. I know the rabbi or whomever. And I will not take one comment, one presentation, and extrapolate from that to create some kind of a synthetic monster, as if this person's entire personality were only this opinion and everything that I extrapolate from it. So I think we need to work with very great care as we move through the methane pockets of our contemporary Jewish world. Let me move from that to, I think, an example. When I speak about the local speech, you see, one of the things which has made this whole chapter painful, distasteful, I would say to the point of repugnant, is that I know these people, right? I know what they've done, who they are, and to hear people take an isolated incident and impute motives and speak and create a kind of a spurious pseudo-biography replete with condemnatory labels and scornful disparagements, it just kills me. Because these are real people. And they are people who gave, in most cases, their lives to Klal Yisrael way before they had an opinion on the question of young ladies wearing tefillin. So knowing the personalities, let me give you what I believe is the soil from which this decision on the part of my colleagues at SAR grew. First of all, the guiding principle of education, Chanuch lenar al pi darko, the verse from Mishlei, raise up the young person according to his or her way. In other words, there is no area in Jewish law where individuation is more specifically mandated than in chinuch. If you don't find the child, if you don't identify what will be the unique path to that child's heart, then you are a failure as a mechanech. That is why systems of chinuch, which are straight-laced, one-size-fits-all, the notion of a repressively uniform approach to the education of Jewish children, I believe, is keneged halacha. And we have suffered for that. When educational method becomes a sacrifice on the altar of traditionalism, we will do it because it's the way we did it, we lose children. And I believe there will be a price to pay. I believe that SAR and its faculty have always understood this. The desire to see the individual child, to hear the individual child, to nuance the presentation of Torah to that individual child's capacity to hear and open and understand, has been from the very beginning, and certainly can't help remembering the late Audrey Shergan, Zichrona Livracha. And that spirit that each child is a world, that is SAR at its best. The second component of that soil, I believe, is true Avas Yisrael. And Avas Yisrael means a loving, respectful attitude toward all of Klal Yisrael, toward Jews, and a very strong disinclination to allow into the school a kind of a spirit of judgmentalism and holier than thou superiority as one speaks about those whose way of observance differs. That is usually an extremely positive policy. Because, to tell you the truth, in many quadrants of the Jewish world, long before people learn, they learn to hate. And they define themselves in terms of the groups that they have been mandated to disparage. And so you have people who are functionally quite ignorant, who proclaim their membership in the club by the stridency with which they speak of the other. In SAR, that has never been allowed. One scores no points for a kind of blind zealotry, to be dismissive or scornful of other Jews or of non-Jews, for that matter. Right? And those who have been here with me over these many years, I would hope know that spirit of derision is not part of our message. It's for that reason, for example, that despite the Koren Sidur's advice to the contrary, and some serious halachic authorities, I have never allowed the Chazan to reintroduce into the Aleinu Shehem Mishtachavim Lehevel Varik, describing those who worship in other religions as people who bow to vanity and emptiness. I don't believe that we need to pray to God through the vehicle of disparagement. That being said, how would I approach a case where people whose sincerity, whose aspirational code I fully endorse and revere, how do I approach it when, on a particular given issue, I might differ? Well, I'll give you an example, which is the interpretation of the Nitziv of a Midrash, which I actually mentioned from the pulpit, I believe it was last week, but I'll mention it again, just in brief. There is a discrepancy in the way in which the anointment of Aaron HaKohen is described in Parshas Tetzaveh when it is prescribed, and the way in which it plays out in Parshas Tzav when it actually happens. Parshas Tetzaveh assumes that Aaron will be anointed together with his sons in a kind of a group anointment. Parshas Tzav, it is clear that Aaron is being lifted above his sons and anointed with a unique process. He is anointed separately. And the Nitziv asks, why did Moshe Rabbeinu change his process after God had already instructed it? And the Nitziv answers based on a midrash, that what has happened between one and the other is the Egel Hazav, is the story of the golden calf. The story of the golden calf is a story of Aaron supporting a popular desire and trying to turn it in the direction of Avodas Hashem, and miscalculating, and instead accidentally giving aid and succor to an energy which took things in another direction. And so here is Moshe Rabbeinu, after this miscalculation, faced with his brother, and instead of questioning whether he deserved to be the Kohen Gadol, he actually promoted him to an even higher level. Why? Because what Moshe looked at was not the specifics of the Egel Hazav, which certainly were a catastrophe by any estimation. What he looked at was what kind of Avas Yisrael, what kind of love for the Jewish people, where Aaron got into the trenches with them and tried to take their energy and move it toward God. What kind of Avas Yisrael was behind such a thing? It was majestic. So Moshe said, what I take out of this is a man who could be motivated by such love, regardless of the fact that in a particular instance it misfired. That love deserves to be raised to the level of the Kahuna Gedola. That love deserves to be at the forefront of the leadership of the Jewish people. And so, even before I would make my comments on this particular decision, looking at the people whom I know to be behind it, even if I disagree on this particular issue, even if I would question the calculations, the mathematics, I respond exactly like Moshe Rabbeinu. That as far as the motivations behind it, as far as the commitment to find each Jewish child, as far as the commitment to the loving respect of Am Yisrael, those are exactly the people who should be in Jewish education. With or without what I would call a specific situational miscalculation, we're not talking about something which puzzles. We're talking about something which illustrates a level of attitude and commitment, which is exactly what we should be seeking in those to whom we entrust our children. So, how would I look at the particulars of this situation? And I hope Rabbi Hartstark will note I'm not quoting anybody from all of the blogs and so-called Piskei Halacha and opinions on right and on left and journalism. I'm not quoting one single document, with the exception of Rabbi Hartstark's very, very carefully crafted letter to the parent body of the yeshiva, because I'm part of that parent body, so to a certain extent I feel is addressed to me as well, albeit as the parent of alumni. Precisely because I think that letter is very beautifully crafted, and I believe that on some of its phrases we can delineate where good people would differ. First, on the issue of Chanuch Lenar al Pi Darko. One of the things that makes it very complicated to apply this principle is that I believe that at least through the times of Torah Shebichsav, through the biblical period, the assumption is that education is primarily carried on in the home. And when it says Lenar al Pi Darko, it is addressing a parent educating a child, just as in Kriyas Shema it says V'shinantam levonecha. The notion of an institutional setting where children are educated is not part of what the Bible imagines. And so Chanuch Lenar becomes a little more complicated when one moves it into the setting of a school, which means that it is already a communal communal activity. The school itself being a community, the school being in a community, and the school being part of a community of schools. Right? This perhaps requires, like the move from two-dimensional to three-dimensional chess, some additional levels of caution. Why? Because as a kind of a starting point, I believe that when parents send their children to an Orthodox school, there is a kind of a presumption that within the walls of that school, just as every treat in the candy machine should be assumed to be kosher, that everything that goes on in that school should be something which meets halachic standards and which may be considered within parameters to be an expression of orthodoxy. So, for example, if you have a school which has a minyan for Ashkenazim and a minyan for Sfardim, Ashkenazim have their own traditions, but it is clearly understood that the Sephardic minyan is also a halachic minyan. It's part of the universe of halacha. If, for example, as you have in communities like San Francisco, you're talking about a community high school which serves all of the denominational streams, then clearly Orthodox parents who send their children to such schools understand that not everything that goes on under the roof meets the standard of orthodoxy, and so their children need to be sent to school with filters, blinders, selectors, whatever you'd like to say, knowing that not everything that goes on in the shul meets the standard that our family might hold. The changing of that, if there were such a thing, if an Orthodox school introduced things which were non-halachic, then there is a certain disingenuousness, betrayal of the parents who signed up for one product and perhaps got another. And not necessarily what their children were forced to do, but on the assumption we saw it in school, therefore it must be kosher, it must be orthodox. Similar to, and I don't want this example to be, don't push it further than it needs to be. If a rabbi has a situation, someone in a family passes on, and they want to be buried in the synagogue's cemetery, and the rabbi learns that that individual was never halachically converted. That individual is, technically speaking, not Jewish. Now, on a humane level, the rabbi may say, look, here's a family. They've just lost, perhaps they've lost a parent tragically, 30-some-year-old person, lo aleinu v'lo aleichem, is killed in an accident, and the whole community is just in pieces. Wouldn't it be humane to let this person be buried in the cemetery? Well, that is true on one hand. On the other hand, if people have been offering their relatives for burial in that cemetery for 80 years, then all of those people relied upon us as gatekeepers to see to it that this would be truly a Jewish cemetery. And so to change definitions when there are people depending upon us in that gatekeeping capacity would be problematic. Further, there is another dimension. If one allows for the perception of a halachic border transgression, if I've sent my children, even if it's not real, even if it's perceived, If I sent my child in the 9th grade to a high school on the presumption they'll be there for 4 years, and if a perception exists that the school has deviated in some direction or another, and that in turn affects recruitment for the next year, then progressively, if the reputation of the school as a certain kind of school is allowed to shift in the marketplace, well, then the children who will be going to school with my child, with my freshman who will be a sophomore, who will be a junior, who will be a senior, the character of the influx changes. It will be drawing from a slightly different population from the population that it was drawing on when my family signed up. So that is a complication of individuation. That if an individuation changes the character in the sense that when you walk into the kosher supermarket, now you have to check labels just like you did at the A&P, when the appeal of the kosher supermarket was that everything on every shelf has already been checked, and if you see it there, you may assume that it is kosher to the highest level. If that changes, then it has implications both for the population and for the question of future populations. If, and as I have not yet argued that that is the case in our situation, but I'm trying to broadly outline what the stakes are and why it is that ultimate individuation is difficult when it has impact on the character of a community. When it threatens to change us from being a kosher supermarket to being a supermarket with kosher products, which I think is an important distinction. And of course, there is secondarily the influence on other school communities, which look to a given school, a large school, a prestigious school, to set standards and to guide the way. Now, also in terms of the understanding of Chanukah Lenar, because this is something which I believe does enter the discussion to a certain extent, I think that there is a strong distinction to be made between a commitment to all Jews, by which we mean each child, and a commitment to all Judaisms. When a child comes into a system with anomalous needs, the child who has a particular handicap, the child who perhaps has, different lifestyle experiences, and accommodating that child, helping that child to feel comfortable, to feel loved, to feel accepted, I think there, the commitment to the individual, as it has always been expressed by SAR, is second to none. For example, and I don't mean this to imply that it's a handicap, I don't think that there is any school, to my knowledge, which has taken children who come from other countries, often but not always Israel, children who come into the school without language, with a whole different experience, and mobilizes not only the faculty but the students to make sure that person feels 100% welcome. There's no one who does it like SAR. I mean, those who've been close to the school community, we've seen time and time again, children who enter the SAR community in the most fragile age groups We're talking 6th and 7th and even 8th graders. A child who comes from another place with another language and enters the academy in the 8th grade, Rachmana litzlan, and has to find a place in a peer group of children who've been together for 10 or 11 years, practically born together. And when those children march up the aisle, and you see the faces of these newcomers who have in the course of a single year become as close and as beloved as the ones who've been there for all of the years, you know that you're in a holy place. I do believe, though, that when the particularities of a child are coming because that child comes from a different denominational perspective, when that child is coming from a heterodox education or family upbringing, I think that the obligation to make those children 100% comfortable is really different. And Rabbi Hartstark's letter speaks about these young women with whom the case deals, that they have been taught in accordance with their family practice. Well, you know, if you told me that they were from Kurdistan and they had old minhagim based upon that tradition, then I would say family practice has the resonance that they are carrying an ancient and holy minhag, which we simply may never have seen, right? If you had the first Sephardi kid who ate rice on Pesach, I mean, I think we have more than a few now, but if you had an Ashkenazic situation and the rabbi or the teacher was talking about kitnios on Pesach, I would say that if that child is in the room, there is an absolute obligation to say that there are communities of devout, believing Jews who have a different custom, and they eat kitnios on Pesach. And if you happen to go to your friend's house and find them eating rice, do not think that they are not as religious as you. I, again, personally, and I say that, it doesn't mean I'm equivocating. It means I really believe that if that family practice is coming from heterodoxy, if it's coming because they were raised in another denominational stream which views halacha differently, and I'll speak about some of those differences, I don't believe that that family practice should be put on par with family practice growing out of a Masorah or a branch of the Masorah. Because at that point, I think we're putting something on the shelf in this kosher supermarket which we cannot, with clear conscience, say we accept the hashgacha, and if you married into this family and need to accommodate that minhag, that we would be fine with it. The next issue, I believe, goes to a phrase which Rabbi Hartstark used in his letter, and I think perhaps this is a crucial area where friends could differ, where he speaks of viewing the acceptance of the mitzvah of Tefillin by women as a legitimate practice, albeit different from our communal practice, but one that has halachic justification. So a lot in this discussion is going to hang on the question of what would constitute halachic justification. And Rabbi Hartstark, who has always been, and I only know him, I think, somewhere around 35 years. Even as a junior in high school, he was known as like really one of the most accomplished young men in the yeshiva, and nothing has changed. He's only gotten smarter with age. He cites here, obviously he wasn't writing this as a tshuva. He cites here, it has basis in the Rishonim. He mentions the Rambam, the Rashba, and the Sefer HaChinuch, and perhaps the Mechaber of Yosef Karo. That he found basis for the notion of women accepting the mitzvah of tefillin on themselves. Now here, I think that to say that there are opinions in the Rishonim and to equate that with halachic justification is a methodological jump that I would take issue with. Particularly today in the great culture of the Bar Ilan Shilas and Shuvas project, we have access to a couple of thousands of years of various opinions. These opinions will be winnowed in one of two ways. The first question to ask is, were these academic opinions or were they put into practice? Right? There are many discussions in halacha which never got beyond the academic phase. In other words, in concept, one could understand the possibility of X. Would that rabbi who entertained that possibility, would he, if someone came to him and said, okay, then can my daughter put on tefillin? We have no such record. And discussions which were held for only in a purely academic context and never were actualized in practice, never moved from the Beis Medrash to application, those are much more dubious. Second, one way to test a given practice, which may, by reaching back, have some basis in rabbinic literature, is to ask, has this ever actually, even certainly in the last 500-600 years, has it been expressed as halacha l'maisa in any particular community? Did it hold on? So that if you were to suggest, for example, that among the Jews of Yemen, an ancient and very authentic but somewhat isolated community, if you were to say that among the Jews of Yemen, tefillin have been worn by women for 1,000 years, that would be a compelling argument, because it would say that this has been in practice. It made the leap from concept to practicality. That would be a telling process. However, what we find in the case of tefillin in particular, there are traditions of why it is that women were discouraged from putting on tefillin, even in places where they were encouraged to do other positive commandments. There, from the Ramah, who is the authority for Ashkenaz, under most circumstances. Now, people will say to you, there are occasions where we dispute the Ramah. And that is true. There are actually traditions of areas of halacha where in certain areas of halacha the Ramah is treated like, an equal with other early achronim. However, in many areas of halacha, the Ramah has a towering presence in Ashkenaz, and particularly, and this is something which was pointed out to me clearly by Rabbi Genack, in cases where none of the people who have the right to argue with the Ramah, in other words, the people who weren't nervous about the Ramah, like Rosenblatt is. I mean, if the Ramah walked into that door, aside from the fact that I would be quite surprised to see a person who had been dead for a few hundred years, I could get over that. The Ramah walked into that door. I would be so struck with awe and trembling that I would probably need somebody to hold me up. But there were people who didn't feel that way about the Ramah. The Shach and the Taz, the Mogen Avraham, these were people who were not afraid on a good day to take the Ramah on and to suggest that the halacha should take a different direction. In this particular case, there is no one of real stature since the Ramah's time. And remember, he also knew the Rambam and the Rashba, etc. There is no one in the classic halachic literature, none of those who could take him on this point ever did. And that means that whereas we may have something, we may have an act, a behavior which has a mention in halachic literature, I would argue that we do not have what, as I understand it, meets the criteria of halachic justification for a new practice. I believe we have textual echoes, but not to the point which would create halachic justification. Now, what are factors that can move a text into the area of halachic justification? So I'll talk about one which I believe is one which is possible, and two which are spurious. Let us understand what moves the halachic process. You know, much has been made of the phrase, where there's a halachic will, there's a halachic way. So let's ask ourselves, what is it that creates a halachic will? And let's ask this respectfully, looking at the system as one which is both sacred in its origins and sacred in its mobilization throughout Jewish history. The first thing that creates halachic will, frankly, is suffering. When a Jew or Jews is suffering and needs relief, halachic authorities throughout the ages have displayed extraordinary creativity and zeal. You will have only to read the traditional literature about agunot, particularly after great conflicts like the World Wars, where people saw that people's lives, aside from loss, were further being compromised by their inability to get a halachic status which allowed them to continue. And that goes right down to 9/11. You can read the book that Rabbi Rees, our own Rabbi Rees, is a hero in this area. He and Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz, they both live and be well, were heroes in helping families after 9/11 to move forward. So the first thing is need, is suffering. If a Jew is suffering, if there's real need, if there's economic duress. I mean, we had a case in Riverdale recently, I can't reveal the details, where a given business, which was really tottering, needed a significant halachic allowance. Rabbi Willig worked, I don't even want to think about how many hours he researched until he found a reasonable halachic argument. And after he found that halachic argument, in addition to consulting with colleagues, he even called me to see that I was comfortable. And with all that, he told me that he had been up all night weighing and looking into his conscience before he gave this heter, which he did. In this one case, this particular case, believe me, I don't believe that the worry about this particular person's financial future, the worry that this person experienced in their sleepless nights, was in any way greater than the worry that Rabbi Willig experienced on their behalf. Not his worry about would he give a heter, but first he began from the sense of what this meant to those people. The second thing which moves the halachic process, perhaps a little one notch down, is opportunity. In other words, when we can innovate within halacha and thereby achieve some great goal. I think that the development, for example, of the Beis Yaakov movement could be perhaps classified under this. An opportunity, also a need, but a place where the halachic system saw motivation. The least, frankly, the least effective way to move the halachic system is to demand of it. To say, get us permission to do X. That tends, frankly, and this is descriptive, not necessarily, I'm just telling you how the machinery works. The machinery tends to go into lockdown in the face of someone coming with demand. You must give us a way to do this because we want to do it. Poskim it's just not a big motivator. Not a big motivator. It's not the way they tend to work. So when we talk about what can move halachic process, in some cases, even to the point, with collaboration, with due diligence, sometimes to even reach back for precedents, need, real suffering has the best shot, opportunity has a decent shot, demand has a very small shot. So how is it that others suggest we move forward? Well, one is to, frankly, ignore the organic side of halacha and simply to say we can find a text from way back when and we will take it, and it allows us, we find precedent, and that's sufficient. That is, frankly, the way the conservative movement reached some of its conclusions in areas where their halachic system deviated in theory from traditional psak. Another way is, I think, more subtle and more dangerous. Understand that all of halacha is not black and white. It's not you can do this, you can't do this. Here's how much matzah you have to eat in order to be. It's not all that simple, because within halacha, and this frankly is what characterizes what I would call the more universal halachic insiders, people like Rav Kook, Rav Herzog, etc., there is something which we could call meta-halacha. Meta-halacha is norms distilled from the halacha, but which are not particular to one area or another. So, for example, kavod habrios, the respect for human dignity, which is applied in many areas of halacha, for example in Hilchos Shabbos, where certain things are permitted because they will prevent a human being from being humiliated. Right? And there are sugyas all over Shas about kavod habrios. Darkei shalom, things which bring peace with non-Jewish neighbors. So, for example, the extension of philanthropic activity beyond the Jewish community, to help the non-Jewish poor, to heal the non-Jewish sick, right? These are what I would call meta-halachic principles. Imitating these are principles which are, I would say, injected into the halacha, new principles which are finessed with a kind of an inductive process. What do I mean? A concept, let me give an outlandish example so that before everyone picks up their swords, we can at least have an idea what I'm trying to get across. The Reform movement has been known to say that a woman's right to choose an abortion is a Jewish concept. It doesn't mean that's not true. It doesn't mean it's a Jewish concept. It means that it is part of the Weltanschauung of Reform Judaism, and in one way or another they will try to find precedent in the tradition, but it's not coming from the tradition. It's in a sense being imposed, or on a good day with a strong tailwind, discovered in the tradition. Concepts like egalitarianism, or more slippery inclusiveness, which are discovered by inductive reasoning. In other words, if you find a given rabbi who rules on a given case where someone who thought he or she was not included in a given practice, and they find justification to include them, to allow them to do a certain thing, and therefore to say, what was motivating this rabbi? He believed in inclusiveness. So if you went to that rabbi and you said to him, do you believe in inclusiveness? He would say, what are you talking about? I don't know how, tell me where in the Gemara inclusiveness appears. I know that in this particular case, I see a way in Psak. The problem with these meta concepts is they're not meta coming out of halacha, they're meta coming from other places and then being sort of dropped on halacha. When they are used as halachic guidance, in other words, we will say this because it advances the value of, for example, inclusiveness, then you stand a serious risk of introducing foreign matter into the body of halacha. Something which stems from a completely different area. And indeed, whereas inclusiveness values the dropping of all distinctions and barriers in the general culture, I would say that you can make a much stronger case in halacha for the concept of havdalah, which is to make distinctions. We do make distinctions. Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol, ben or lechoshech, ben Yisrael lo amim, ben yom hashavi l'sheshes yemei hamaseh, all the things where we make a fine line, and we do make a fine line. We make a fine line. It's called 1 minute it's Shabbos, and the next minute it isn't Shabbos. Someone has to tell you when is Shabbos over. Yesterday, Shim was talking to his children. He said, and he had to make a flight last night to Chicago. I hope he got out all right. And he said, Shabbos is over at 6:12. And I said, no, 6:13. Does it make a difference? Yeah. Conceptually, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol means we are in the business of making distinctions. Now, distinctions do not mean, are not intended to be pejorative. The decision whether I am or am not a Kohen, whether I can or can't go to a cemetery, whether I can or cannot duchen, doesn't mean that if I'm not a Kohen, my value has been diminished. It means that a distinction has been made, and I have to find God on my side of a given line. And so, as we look for correct halachic process, we have to know that it follows certain steps. And that it is, first, the mere appearance of a text somewhere in Jewish history is not the automatic basis for halachic action. Two, that the absence of any example in a living Jewish community, now or along the way, is a very serious question mark, a marker, a red flag. And that the desire to bring halachic practice into congruence with values only really works when those values are from the halacha, because that means they're as much a halachic source as the specific ones, and not when they are values which have been imposed from on top. And so the question of what is halachic justification is very much the point at which I think good people might differ. Let's go for one moment, and don't worry, I don't have too much more. Let's go for one moment to the issue of tefillin itself. And I do not intend to give a full-blown shir on the history and the halachos of tefillin. However, broadly speaking, certainly for Ashkenazim, the notion that women have the ability to voluntarily accept time-bound positive commandments is widely held halachically. That's why, you can ask Rabbi Genak, our team goes crazy getting about Tekiah to men and to women who find themselves unable to come to shul on Rosh Hashanah. It's a mitzvah saseh shazman grama. Nevertheless, women, certainly Ashkenazic women, have taken it very seriously, even to the point that they are allowed to say a blessing. Their volunteerism brings them completely into the pale. The Gemara concludes that tefillin is indeed a mitzvah saseh shazman grama, and so it should be open to the pious female volunteer. Why has tradition said in that particular instance it is not? And that is because tefillin represent, I wouldn't say a unique, but an unusual phenomenon in halacha. It's kind of like it's a high voltage mitzvah. It is a mitzvah which I believe I would say is predicated on something which borders on the unnatural. To take basically the equivalent of a miniaturized Sefer Torah, an object of kind of an ultimate exalted physical sanctity, and to take it and bind it on the human body. Now understand that the human body, particularly the Jewish human body, is unique in its susceptibility, for example, to the concept of tumah. The only thing which can be alive and tameh is a Jew. right? Only a Jew can be a Metzora, a Zav, a Zava, etc. All of these states which require people to go to the mikveh or to have the ashes of the red heifer sprinkled on them, only a Jew has this capacity. So the Jewish body is this exceptionally volatile entity. And it's the holiest thing in the world. You could burn a Sefer Torah to save a Jew. And on the other hand, it is a portal for all of these concepts of impurity. To take an object so sacred and bind it on that body is something which, even where males are concerned, the tradition sees attention. They talk about guf naki, and even that term is very difficult to pin down. It has sort of changed in its expression through halachic literature. Literally, it means a clean or pure body. But where do we see the reticence where men are concerned? And this has nothing to do with a woman's monthly cycles. So we see, for example, the restrictions on a woman, namely that she should stay away from tefillin, are the same restrictions that are placed on a male Eved Kanani, a Canaanite bondsman, who has also the same mitzvah set as a woman. Right? Why? Because if you can avoid this high voltage confrontation, this possibility that you will fail in what you bring to the tefillin, that you will wrap the tefillin onto something which is not a proper receiver. Doctor, it hurts when I do this. Don't do it. Tremble and don't do it. It goes even further. Why do you think it is? We raise up young children with the concept of chinuch. Child who knows how to shake a lulav, get him a lulav. Child who knows how to listen to a shofar, let him listen, let her listen, let them blow. The tefillin we hold off, according to some authorities. We have all because we like tefillin parties. Basically, Jews love catering, right? Anything from Dunkin' Donuts to Chateaubriand, and the Jews love it. Right? If you wanted to introduce anything into Jewish life connected to food or the avoidance of death, and you're in like Flynn, right? So we love tefillin parties. So people go looking for minhagim. Is our minhag to put it on a month before? Is it 3 months before? But understand that according to many poskim, the first time a boy is allowed to put on tefillin is the day of his actual bar mitzvah. Why? Because once he's obligated, he has no choice. He has to risk the confrontation. But until that day, if you're not obligated, the halacha seems to be saying you should be too nervous. My Rebbe told me something when I was in the 11th grade. My Rebbe Shlita, Rabbi Yosef Rottenberg in Baltimore. Maybe religiously the determining force in my life. And Rebbe told us a story, and I never understood it until I began to look into this area. Rebbe told us that, he says, you guys think the Rambam was such a modern guy. You think, Aristotle and philosophy and everything, you think he was like a college professor. He says, do you know that when the Rambam would lay tefillin, he trembled so that 2 people had to hold him up merely to make the act physically possible? And Rebbe told me that 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. I never understood. That's exactly what this sugya hinges on. And the Rambam, because he was the greater Talmid Chacham, understood the potential danger in the face of this confrontation. So I believe that the mitzvah of tefillin has educationally perhaps a unique message. A message that mitzvahs are not only instruments of positive religious expression, That they are not only opportunities to find a way to serve God, they are also opportunities to experience that trembling. To understand that we are engaging something that is deeply sacred. And halavai, and that, by the way, is also why there's nothing in the halacha that should let men off of wearing their tefillin all day. You should go to work in your tefillin. You go, you're a car mechanic, you flip the shell roche behind your thing when you go under the car, you try not to get axle grease on it. You should be working in tefillin all the time. We whip those things off as quickly as we can. You think the people who take them off at a Volet Zion are the people in shul and not that religious. That's not true. Those may be the people who understand that every moment that we're in tefillin, we are in a state of unsustainable, almost unsustainable aspiration. And so we minimize that window. If the girls had nothing else to contribute, I wish they would teach the boys to tremble. Perhaps if the boys trembled when they put on their tefillin, they might also take them home over the weekend and spend their few moments on Sunday morning trembling as they wrap them. And I think that this concept of trembling, the idea that there is something here which takes part in an exalted higher energy than what we actually can comprehend or integrate into our experience, I think that would be an element in Jewish education which would enrich it, which would deepen. And to understand that sometimes standing away is as profound an acknowledgement of the yoke of heaven as wanting to reach forward. Two more points briefly. There is a discussion about Michal bas Shaul. Michal, the daughter of Shaul HaMelech, King Saul. And there actually are two different texts. There is a text in the Gemara which says that she wanted to put on tefillin, and the sages did not dissuade her, did not prevent her. And then the same story appears in the Psikta and says that she wanted to put on tefillin, and the sages did. So let's be liberal. According to those who say that she was allowed, they say that they perceived in Michal bas Shaul this extraordinary level of devotion, of reverence, that they understood that if there was a person in the world who deserved to be able to put on tefillin, it was Michal bas Shaul. So let us hypothesize. Let's leave aside where the initial motivation or practice, where it came from. Let's just take a look at the child who stands before us and the mechanech's deep insight who says, this child is Michal bas Shaul. I see in her a level of sincerity, understanding, and aspiration to purity that is absolutely beyond reproach. And I frankly think that a mechanech has the right to recognize that. I believe, though, that it's extremely important to remember that Michal bas Shaul was taught, even according to the tradition that says that she put on tefillin, she was taught that she was a yechidah, that she was a very special case. And that if she were to put on her tefillin, she was to do so in the utmost privacy, but not the privacy of one who does something shameful or dirty. The privacy of someone for whom a space has been carved which simply cannot be replicated on a regular basis. I think, frankly, that in Rabbi Hardstark's letter, I think that that spirit is actually present. The notion that these young ladies would be given their place only among other women who understood the nature of their motivation, who understood the peculiarity of the privilege extended to them. I really believe that that spirit of Michal Bas Shol is part of this letter. However, we also see that it took no time whatsoever for this to jump, and in another school, that subtlety was abandoned, and the notion anyone who wants to can do it, and they can do it in the public sphere. Now it's interesting. One of the things that I feel sad and frustrated in terms of our real agenda, we have worked very hard, and I think I've only articulated what frankly is part of a larger process. One of the defining elements in what I call modern orthodoxy, or otherwise known as true orthodoxy. And that is that we have never deviated from the norm that it takes 10 adult men, Jewish men, to make a minyan. However, we have added to that in order to be a tzibur, one needs the presence of women. Women bring a ruchnius, they bring a totality to the community that is very important. And this, frankly, is an area where we differ strongly from most of what we would define as the fervently Orthodox, the Haredi community, where the notion of a place of prayer where men are completely unaware that there are any women anywhere, like one-way glass mechitzos and balconies and all those kinds of things, where the desideratum is an all-male environment, where women may be spectators, but no male is aware of their presence. That is not the way I understand our avoda. That is not desirable. Desirable is a mokom tefillah where there is no congress between men and women. There is no joviality, if you will, no socializing, but where the reverent presence, awareness of the presence of the other is a constant. Where young men, I think it is extremely important. For example, I think it is important for young men to watch their mothers pray and for young women to watch their fathers pray. Because I think this should ideally guide them when they look for a mate. If your bride-to-be reminds you of your mother's reverence when you looked over and saw the tears on her cheeks during Ne'ilah, then there is a good chance that from such a union you will see those tears on the cheeks of your daughters. And the same way in the other direction, as young women watch their fathers. In that atmosphere, I think that there has to be an even higher sensitivity to the positive definitions of roles, the preservation of the notion that Orthodox Judaism, that authentic Judaism, is primarily bimorphic, which means that it has a shape for men and a shape for women, and that mixing those is ultimately going to have a less than positive result. On the other hand, the visibility of women in the tzibur reminds the men that a system of education which only bestows its resources on males, because that's all we see, and doesn't make sure that if bimorphic, the education of women has to be as inspiring, as content-filled, or more than the education of men, then you would have missed the boat as well. But the preservation of a dynamic bimorphism, I believe, is core to our authentic practice. And so the presentation on the two sides of the mechitza, knowing that the other side is watching, needs to be carefully marshaled so that those roles are kept clear. There's just one more word on Michal Bashol, and where, again, I have a great deal of sympathy for the SAR position, even though, as I'm sure you've noted, I don't agree with it. A young lady once came to me, whom I knew to be a student in a non-Orthodox seminary. A young girl I'd known most of her life. And she said that in her school, the women all put on tefillin. And she didn't know anything about it, but she was going to follow suit. Now remember, this is before any of the atmosphere was charged with politics. I took her into my home, and I took my spare pair of tefillin, and I put it into her hands, and I said, listen, my dear, until you get your own tefillin, you'll use mine. Not because I believe you should. You didn't ask me that. But because I want to know that if you're going to put on tefillin, I want to know that you will never make a bracha levatala. That you will put on tefillin that are kosher. As far as the halacha is concerned, I acknowledge you make choices, but you're still mine. And I will hold you and guard you to the extent that I can, even if you go beyond my authority and my control, and frankly, my good advice. There is one paragraph of Rabbi Hartstark's letter, which not only do I concur with, I think I could have written. And that is the final paragraph, where he discusses the terrible, terrible way in which this debate has been conducted, the disrespectful way in which it has been conducted, particularly people who take it upon themselves to disparage young students whom they've never met and probably will never meet. And I would like to think that even whereas in his beautiful language, Rabbi Hartstark says, we recognize the sanctity and dignity of each person, and we find ways to support their spiritual growth in different ways. I would like to think that my approach, the approach of the RJC, even as it acknowledges certain boundaries which we will not and would not have crossed, it begins from the same premise of the sanctity and dignity of each person. And that our striving, that even as we are committed to the halachic process in its classical application, even as we are committed to the growth of bimorphic Judaism, even as we are committed to values that not only cohere within halacha, but actually derive from it and represent the expression of the halacha in its most exalted form. That our striving for authenticity will never, ever go unbalanced by a dedication to the striving for humanity, to use his words to recognize the sanctity and dignity of each person. So now, for the executive summary, in case anyone has nodded off, there's been a very long talk. But you know what? I'm not apologizing. Shabbos, you need the sermon to be under whatever X minutes because you have a cholent waiting. We already fed you, so don't complain. But this is a very delicate and very nuanced subject. And I don't apologize for not taking shortcuts, at least in my understanding. In the executive summary, I respectfully differ with the SAR conclusion. I differ based on a different interpretation of halachic process, or halachic justification. From that difference, I emerge continuing my support for my yeshivas and for my colleagues. I think that in Rabbi Krauss and Rabbi Hartstark, SAR has secured for itself two of the most extraordinary Jewish educators in the world. I don't know of anyone in the field of Jewish education who has been more thoughtful and creative in his whole approach, basically reinventing high school education, than Rabbi Hartstark. And K'tzas Shivcho Shal Adam B'fanav, I won't say more. And so despite the fact that I disagree on this issue, I have not, so to speak, changed my mind about the worthiness of Aaron HaKohen's descendants in our generation, our community. And I commit with them to pull no punches in expressing our opinions, L'man Hashem and L'man Klal Yisrael, with absolute clarity and without apology, but also to expressing them under the shared mandate of sanctity and dignity, so that Hashem will not only be proud of our conclusions, because of course each side thinks he's right, but that he will also not be ashamed of the spirit in which we processed our disagreements. And I hope that every child in SAR, including the two young women who I assume will continue to put on tefillin, know that there is just a regular shul rabbi in Riverdale who loves them very much and who hopes that Hashem will guide them and prosper their way wherever it will be. Just as I know that the educators in SAR feel exactly that way about the children whose families will tell them that this course of action has no place in a halachic school or a halachic community. I know I've kept you a very long time, but if there are those who would like to ask me questions in public, I suppose I should offer Rabbi Hartstark the first javelin. If there are those who would like to ask questions in public, I'm happy to receive a few. If there are those who would prefer to ask their questions to me in private, then I am always and ever at your disposal. Was there anyone who wanted to ask anything publicly, or I'll just worn you poor people down to a nub? Thank you very, very much for coming. Yes.
For those who aren't a member of the SIR parent community, are copies of the Heart Starts letter available?
If you will send me your email, I will email you a copy. And it is a beautiful letter. Okay? Thank you so much, everyone.